Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are. Blue-black has the color combination of secrecy, instant speed, and card advantage. And there's roughly 100 eligible commanders. As usual in this series, I present to you the ones that stood out to me the most, whether it be for power level, uniqueness, or flavor. So, whether you're listening to this while waiting for your car windows to clear up, while brewing some tea, or sitting in front of the oven, sit back, relax, and enjoy. To start the list off, let's go for a classic tribal commander in Alela Cunning Conqueror, a 4-mana 2/4 fairy warlock with flying. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, create a 1/1 black fairy rogue creature token with flying. And whenever one or more fairies you control deal combat damage to a player, goad target creature that player controls. At first glance, of course, this is pretty straightforward. Fairies often have flash, fairies often reward you for casting instants, so you want to play all the opts and considers that you can find. One mechanic that came to my mind when I thought of this was, how do you repeatedly cast instants? And there's multiple ways. One is the buyback mechanic, which is great if you have a lot of mana. The other one that came to my mind is Retrace, which allows you to play a card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying the cost of the spell. Now this is of course very intense on cards in hands, but blue-black should have an easy time to fill their hand with a lot of cards. So cards like Glamour Dye and Una's Grace, Una's Grace even has the name of a very popular fairy commander, so it's no coincidence that it works well with fairies. Definitely consider these Retrace cards for your Alela Cunning Conqueror deck. Maybe Arumi of the Dead Tide is my favorite commander on the list. It's a 3-mana 1/4 Merfolk Wizard. When you tap Arumi, exile cards from your graveyard equal to the number of opponents you have, so in Commander, most likely 2 or 3. Then, target creature card in your graveyard gains Encore until end of turn. The Encore cost is equal to the mana cost. Now, what is Encore? Encore means you exile the creature and pay the mana cost. And then for each opponent, you create a token copy that attacks the opponent if able. They of course gain haste because they need to attack, and you sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Activate only as a sorcery. Commanders like this are some of my favorites, where you really have to pick apart the ability to make the most out of them. First of all, you need to exile 3 cards from your graveyard to activate this ability, so you need to have some form of self-mill, which of course is also necessary because you have to have a creature card in your graveyard to give it Encore. Then the Encore ability is equal to the mana cost, so you are rewarded for playing creatures that have low mana cost but high effect for that mana cost. Examples of that could be cards that have extra casting cost. Remember, we are not casting the card, we are exiling it and creating a token copy. We are also rewarded for cards that have good ETBs because we get 3 copies of those. We are also rewarded for attack triggers and dealing damage to opponents. So there is a lot to unpack here. Some of the cards that came to mind when I looked at lower cost cards that work well with this are classics like Archon of Cruelty, which is very expensive but also extremely powerful. Remember, you would activate the cost of Arumi, pay 8, and then you get 3 ETB triggers of Archon and then 3 attack triggers from Archon, which honestly should put you so far ahead, the game's almost over. There's also cards like Duskmangler and Gormand that have additional casting costs to balance out how strong they are. But of course, we're not casting, we're just putting copies onto the battlefield. When Duskmangler enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 4 life. And when Gormand enters the battlefield, each opponent just sacrifices a creature. One last thing that I forgot to mention is these tokens are not exiled, you sacrifice them. This is also a safety valve that is often implemented to make it so you don't also get die triggers. But let's imagine for just 4 mana, you Encore 4 Vindictive Liches, a 4 mana 4/1 zombie wizard that when it dies, you choose one or more. Each mode must target a different player. Target opponent sacrifices a creature, target opponent discards 2 cards, and target opponent loses 5 life. Well, if you have 3 Vindictive Liches, you don't really have to choose. Everybody just does everything. Each opponent sacrifices a creature, discards 2 cards, and loses 5 life for just 4 mana. Captain, oh god. Gathrod is a 5 mana 3/6 Horror Pirate. Horrors you control have Menace. Whenever a horror you control deals combat damage to a player, that player mills that many cards. And the payoff, at the beginning of your end step, choose target artifact or creature card in an opponent's graveyard that was put there from their library this turn. Put it onto the battlefield under your control. Of course, at first this creature tells you to play lots of horrors, but horrors are A, not the best creatures on average, and B, don't really have a lot of tribal synergies going on, in my opinion. But since the payoff clause is written in a way that really doesn't make it necessary for the creatures or artifacts to be put there by a horror, you can just play this as a mill commander that doesn't enhance your milling, but the benefit of milling your dragon opponent and just getting their huge creature end of turn is definitely a nice bonus. There are, of course, good horrors. One that surprised me because I didn't know it existed is Eater of the Dead, a 5 mana 3/4 horror that for 0 mana, if Eater is tapped, you get to exile target creature card from any graveyard and then untap Eater of the Dead. This just screams infinite to me, especially if you're surrounded by a good solid mill package. Remember, you don't need to exile a creature card from your graveyard, just from any graveyard. So that's definitely a horror to look out for. I'm sure there's lots more, but I leave that up to your Scryfall search and your decision. You need to be a braver person than me to play Dralnu Lich Lord, a 5 mana 3/3 zombie wizard. If you know Liches, you know they are very averse to taking damage, and so is Dralnu, because if damage would be dealt to Dralnu, you have to sacrifice that many permanents instead. His ability gives target instant or sorcery in your graveyard flashback until end of turn. The flashback costs are equal to its mana cost. Well, this is actually a pretty powerful payoff. There is quite a few things that interact with flashback. First of all, you're casting a spell from your graveyard, not your hand, which means cards like Secrets of the Dead reward you immediately for just that. There's also Tormod the Desecrator, because as you know, when you flashback a card, it leaves your graveyard and goes to the exile. So Tormod would create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. And there is a somewhat obscure and old card called Catalyst Stone, a 2 mana artifact that makes it so you pay 2 less for your flashbacks, but your opponents pay 2 more for their flashback. Maybe you have a player group where you are 100% certain that no one's playing Blasphemous Act. Good luck finding that play group. And you can actually pull out the Dralnu Lich Lord, but there is so much direct damage stapled to creatures and spells in Commander that honestly, I'd be very scared whenever I play my Commander. And that's usually not what I want from my Commander. Next on the list is Etrata the Deadly Fugitive, a 3 mana 1/4 vampire assassin. Etrata has Death Touch and gives all your face down creatures 4 mana, 2 blue-black. Turn this creature face up. If you can't, exile it, then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. And whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. Remember, cloak turns the card into a 2/2 that you can turn face up if it's a creature for the mana cost. Now let's talk about that phrase, if you can't exile it, then you may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. Why would you ever not be able to turn a creature face up? Well, let's say you cloaked an instant or sorcery, you can't turn that face up. That's why you need to exile it, and then you may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. What I'm interested in is cloaking cards from your own library that have immensely high mana cost, that do not even need to be creatures. There's a few cards that will help you out in this endeavor. Cards like Dream Chisel, which makes it so face down creature spells you play cost 1 less to play, which is just a great discount. And Ixidor, which I talked about in the mono blue video, which gives face down creatures +1/+1, which is, I mean, nice, but for 3 mana you get to turn target face down creature face up. So it's a bit cheaper on turning creatures face up, but what it can't do is turn those instant and sorceries face up. As a reminder, there is right now a lot of mechanics that turn cards face down. There is, of course, the OG Morph and then Mega Morph, but there's also Cloak, which Atrata does. There's Manifest, and now there's also Manifest Dread, and there's also the Disguise mechanic. So as you can see, there's lots of ways to turn creatures, but also non-creatures face down and use Atrata's ability to turn those cards face up, and in case they're not a creature, cast them for just 4 mana. Jon Irenicus, the Shattered One, is a 4 mana 3/3 elf wizard that reads, at the beginning of your end step, target opponent gains control of up to 1 target creature you control. You put 2 +1/+1 counters on it and tap it. It is goaded for the rest of the game, and against this creature can't be sacrificed. Additionally, whenever a creature you own but don't control attacks, you draw a card. Donate is a very small sub-theme in Commander, but it is one that definitely has an audience. Usually, you gift these insta-loss cards like Demonic Pact or Lich's Tomb that might be very, very upsetting to your opponent because nobody likes to build up their game and then somebody just gives them a Demonic Pact that only has 1 trigger left and you start your turn and you lose the game. Jon Irenicus kind of gets around this because a lot of these insta-loss cards are enchantments and artifacts that are harder to interact with, but don't be afraid. There's still loads of creatures that have terrible effects for you. There's cards like Abyssal Persecutor, which is a 4 mana 6/6, literally says you can't win the game and your opponents can't lose the game. And what I like about Jon Irenicus is you do not need this insta win, because slowly but surely you will get your advantages by just giving out these creatures. They can never ever attack you. They cannot be sacrificed. You will draw cards. Honestly, the more I think about it, this looks very, very powerful as a card advantage engine, especially since it doesn't say whenever 1 or more creatures you own but don't control attacks. So even if you give 1 player 3 creatures, you draw 3 cards for that. You might make yourself the enemy number 1 for everyone because some people really don't like goading, but in my opinion, it is one of the coolest and most fun abilities made for Commander. So if you're also a fan of goading, here you have an interesting Commander that combines 2 of these things in a very neat way. There's 3 iterations of Lazav, and all of them kind of do the same thing. It's all about Lazav turning into another creature. That's why I bundled them here. There is Lazav, Dimir Mastermind, a 4 mana 3/3 with hexproof. Whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may have Lazav become a copy, except it's legendary, still called Lazav, and has hexproof in addition to the other abilities. The next one is Lazav the Multifarious, a 2 mana 1/3 shapeshifter. When he enters, surveil 1, and for X mana you can have Lazav become a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with mana value X, except it's still Lazav, it's still legendary, and has this ability to turn into another creature. And Lazav, Wearer of Faces, a 2 mana 2/3 shapeshifted detective. Whenever Lazav attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, then investigate, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature card, exile with it until end of turn. So we have one that just turns into any creature forever until you choose him to become a different creature. We have one that works only with your own graveyard and you have to pay mana. And then we have Lazav, Wearer of Faces, who exiles cards from graveyards and investigates, which creates artifacts, which is, slightly changes some of the things you want to do in your deck. And you have to sacrifice clues for him to become a creature exiled with it, and only until end of turn, unlike the other Lazavs. very, very similar. So as I said, I wanted to bundle them together. And if you're interested in this kind of gameplay, my personal recommendation would be Lazav Dimir Mastermind. Even though you pay 4 mana, he stays as the creature for as long as you want. You can choose destroyed creatures, milled creatures, whatever creatures. And most importantly, he has hexproof, which is one of the premium keywords in Commander, because you're so safe from those Swords to Plowshares and Terras that your playgroup might be playing. Another card that I did not know existed is Marvo Deep Operative, a 5 mana 1/8 Octopus Rogue. Whenever Marvo Deep Operative attacks, clash with a defending player. Now, clash is a keyword that does not appear very often. So let's explain it. Clash means you both reveal the top card of your library, and the higher cost or mana value wins the clash. Now, whenever you win a clash, you get to draw a card, and then you may cast a spell from your hand with mana value 8 or less without paying its mana cost. If we look at the creature type, Marvo is an octopus and a rogue, a very sneaky octopus. So naturally, this would slot into these sea creature type decks. But it doesn't have to be a sea creature, it could also be a huge game-ending demon, whatever floats your boat. Now, since the second clause says whenever you win a clash, not whenever you win the clash that Marvo triggers himself or themselves, you can use the other clash cards. Just a fair warning, including Marvo, there is, according to Scryfall, 13 cards that mention clash in their article text, and most of them are pretty bad. Some of them you can cast repeatedly if you win the clashes, which is cool and could lead to huge snowbally turns. But the big problem, of course, is we need to somewhat take care of the top of our library. But we all know there is great ways of doing that. There's Brainstorm, which is maybe the most famous one, but not far behind that is Sensei's Divining Top, and there's many other ways to manipulate the top of your library that I'm sure you know or will find should you decide to build a Marvo Deep Operative deck. Mirko Obsessive Theorist is a 3 mana 1/3 vampire detective. As a vampire, it has flying, and as a detective, it is very vigilant. Whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on Mirko, and at the beginning of your end step, you may return target creature card from your graveyard with power less than Mirko to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Now, the second line of text, whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on Mirko. That's very nice. The card that comes to mind is Doom Whisperer, which is a 5 mana 6/6 that just lets you pay 2 life to surveil 2, which means you can immediately get Mirko to 6, 7, 8 power, whatever you need. But of course, the interesting part of the ability is that the creature card you return doesn't need to have mana value less than Mirko's, but power less than Mirko's. Oftentimes, creatures are balanced more around their mana cost than their power, which means what you should try to look out for is creatures that have very, very strong ETBs, high mana cost, but low power. An example of a very consistent, good, beloved card is a Muldrifter, but what also comes to mind is creatures that have 0 power, such as Clone, which just is a creature that enters as a copy of another creature, and even if you on curve play Mirko as a 1/3, you'll immediately be able to get back one of the clones, copy the best creature your opponents have, and live a happy life ever after. Nafri, Betrayer of Winter is a commander that has had my attention for a long while, but unfortunately its power is kind of directly linked to snow synergies, and it might need another set like Kaldheim where we get more of those snow permanents. Nefri has the zombie wizard creature type. It's a 4/3, and other snow and zombie creatures you control get +1/+1. And for 3 snow mana of whatever color, you get to return Nafri, Betrayer King from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, the first line of text is not very powerful. If you want a zombie commander, there's much better effects. And even if you want snow creatures, there's probably a better commander out there. We're really playing Nafri because he's stubborn as hell and you can just return him from the graveyard to the battlefield whenever you want. What's good for Nafri is that one of the best payoffs ever printed for Snow is Dead of Winter, a black card, which reads sorcery, 3 mana, all non-snow creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of snow permanents you control. It's kind of like a 3 mana one-sided board clear, which is insane, but really the surrounding package of snow cards isn't quite there yet in my opinion. You can still definitely give it a try, and you can tell me how you build your snow decks if you have one, as snow really is one of the archetypes that is very high on my list of things to do in Commander still. We've reached a halfway point, so let's call back to the beginnings with another fairy in Nimris Una Strixta, a 5 mana 1/6 fairy knight that has flash and flying. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Again, like the first fairy commander, you are rewarded to cast spells during opponent's turn, which again means cards that have buyback, like Slaughter, which just lets you pay for a life for the buyback, or cards with retrace are interesting to you. Every card that has flash is interesting, and every card that is an instant is interesting. What I like about Nimris is that it is a very neat combination of card advantage and filling up your graveyard. This means it is more suited to maybe tie in a reanimate theme into your fairy deck. Now, if we talk about Una's Strixta, we also need to talk about Una, the Queen of the Fae, the OG fairy commander, a 6 mana 5/5 fairy wizard that has flying. For X and a hybrid blue-black mana, you get to choose a color. Target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library, and for each card of the chosen color exiled this way, you get to create a 1/1 blue and black fairy rogue creature token with flying. Now, admittedly, I think Una is probably on the weaker side of fairy commanders, but it's the OG, it's the classic fairy commander in my opinion, and my goodness, the artwork is just gorgeous. Oscar the Rubbish Reclaimer is a 5 mana human wizard and a 3/3 to boot. But Oscar doesn't really cost 5 mana because this spell costs 1 less to cast for each different mana value among cards in your graveyard. Whenever you discard a non-land card, you may cast it from your graveyard. Oscar, in my opinion, is very castable on turn 2 or 3 if you have the right starting hand, which is amazing. Not only do you have a 2 mana 3/3, in some cases, you can also replay him for potentially 2 mana. Just imagine it goes back to the command zone after being killed. It now costs 7 mana, but if you have 5 different casting costs in your graveyard, which is not a lot. So I think this should be really easy. And then really it's about finding the right things for the second ability. Whenever you discard a non-land card, you may cast it from your graveyard. What I immediately looked at is cards that discard a card for mana, because you want to be discarding probably huge things and then casting them instead of just discarding them. What came up was Bogwitch, a 3 mana 1/1 spell shaper that for 1 and black discards a card from your hand, and then you get to add 3 black to your mana pool. And Scourge Familia, which is a better discard outlet. It's a 5 mana 3/2 with flying that just says discard a card, add 1 black mana. Alternative win conditions are a highly debatable topic in Commander, but Ramses Assassin Lord is a 4 mana 4/4 human assassin that does it in a kind of neat way in my opinion. He has Death Touch because he's an assassin. He gives all other assassins you control +1/+1 because he's an assassin lord, but what we care about is whenever a player loses the game, if they were attacked this turn by an assassin you controlled, you win the game. Now, this type of effect that assassins make a player lose a game has been around for a long time, but what I like about Ramses the Assassin is the game just ends and you don't just kick one player out of the game and they have to watch, be super salty, and wait for potentially another half hour until they get to join a Commander game again. No, it's just over. What's interesting to me is if we look closely at the ability, this player does not need to have taken damage from assassins, and he doesn't even need to have lost the game because of the assassins. So in a way, you can just kill him any way you want as long as you have attacked him with an assassin. The condition will have been fulfilled and you will win the game. Now again, please ask your playgroup if they're actually interested in this type of mechanic, if they think it's okay or super obnoxious before building this deck. There's nothing more frustrating than building a new deck, being super excited, but then everybody hates it and nobody wants to play against it. So yeah, be cautious. Rona, the Herald of Invasion, is a 2-mana 1/3 human wizard. Whenever you cast a legendary spell, you get to untap Rona. Why would you want to untap her? Well, because they tap to draw a card and then discard a card. It's a looting commander, which is pretty boring, but first of all, this lends itself to combo-y turns where you just keep untapping this. Remember, you could also give Rona a different ability, let's say like Drain for 10, I don't know if that exists, and then you play a legendary spell and you drain again. So don't just restrict yourself to this looting effect. Just find creative ways to give Rona extremely OP tap abilities. But that is not all that Rona does, in case you're not interested in that type of synergy, because for 5 and a Phyrexian black mana, you get to transform Rona. Let's read what Rona does on our backside. Rona Tolarian Obliterator is a Phyrexian 5/5 wizard with trample. Whenever a source deals damage to Rona, that source's controller exiles a card from their hand at random. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. It's a bit of a twist on the Phyrexian Obliterator that makes people sacrifice permanents for dealing damage to it. In this case, you attack their hand and get to cast things. What is awesome about Rona is usually, I mean, let's be honest, a 5/5 in Commander isn't super threatening. You have 40 life to start with, but Rona is a Commander, which means you can't really take that many attacks from it. What is also a workaround for this is you yourself can damage Rona, exile a card from your own hand, and then cast it without paying its mana cost. To me, this is a very neat design. It's hard to get rid of. You get something, let's say the board gets wiped by Blasphemous Act. You still get something out of their hand, you get to cast it. So Rona, definitely interesting on the front and on the back side, and you can build different decks depending on which side you want to build around. You can of course mix and match, build a deck that can benefit off of both cards. Feel free to do whatever you want. Rona Sheoldred's Faithful is a 4-mana human wizard, a 3/4, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life. You may also cast Rona from your graveyard by discarding 2 cards in addition to paying its other costs. Discarding 2 cards is a steep cost, but blue-black is maybe the color combination best suited to discard cards because so much card advantage is available to it. And then the payoff isn't that great in my opinion. Just draining each opponent 1 life in a game mode where each opponent has 40 life isn't the best, especially if you compare it to traditional Spellslinger commanders. But the one thing that Rona really does have going for it is blue-black. And if you look at blue-black, there isn't many Spellslinger commanders out there. Now for good reason, because black never really had this Spellslinger theme attached to it until very recently, where we got quite a few powerful good payoffs like Sedgemoor Witch or that one Liliana Planeswalker that has Magecraft stapled onto it. So if you want to play Spellslinger, it's really an archetype that you enjoy, but you want to try out those new cool payoffs, maybe Rona is the best way to build Spellslinger in blue-black. We have another flip commander in Runo's Stormkirk. Runo's a 3-mana 1/4 vampire cleric on the front side. It has flying, and when Runo's Stormkirk enters the battlefield, put up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. Then, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card. If it's a creature card with mana value 6 or greater, you get to transform Runo. Runo transforms into Krothus, the Lord of the Deep, a Kraken Horror 3/5 with flying. Whenever Crothus attacks, you get to create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. If that creature is a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent, you get to create 2 of those tokens instead, which is absurdly powerful. First of all, I love the flavor of this commander. While Kinesis and Kiora might be more consistent sea creature type commanders, Runa can do some really degenerate stuff. If you combine Runa with cards like Emperor of Bones or Whip of Erebos that give creatures that you reanimate from your graveyard haste, then you can do some truly obscene stuff, attacking on turn 4, turn 5, reanimating a huge creature and creating 2 tokens. Usually the problem with these haste reanimation effects is the creature only gets haste because you lose it at the end of turn, right? Emperor of Bones makes it so you sacrifice it at the next end step, and Whip of Erebos makes it so you exile it instead. But Crothus really doesn't care. You reanimate that big bad sea creature, you attack with it, you attack with Crothus, and then you are left with 2 gigantic sea creatures. Now, one problem that I could see up if you try to go for it super early is Crothus needs a big creature in your graveyard first, then you put the big sea creature on top and it's not in your graveyard anymore, so you need to also have another good card to reanimate. Or, of course, you have some sort of discard outlet and discard the sea creature that you then draw to transform Crothus, put it back in the graveyard, and then you can reanimate. But yeah, as I said, it might not be as consistent as some of the blue-green sea creature commanders, but first of all, the flavor is awesome, and attacking on turn 4 and almost ending the game with gigantic sea creatures is something those other commanders cannot do. So for those enjoyers of reanimate, for those enjoyers of high roll turns, maybe Crothus is the fitting sea creature commander. If you want to end the game on turn 4, why not play Satoru Umezawa, a 3-mana 2/4 human ninja that reads whenever you activate a ninjutsu ability, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now, that's nice and all, you get some card advantage, some card selections, blah blah blah. What are we really here to do? It's of course the ability each creature card in your hand has ninjutsu for 2 and a blue-black. Goodness gracious. I won't dwell on this for too long. There is tons and tons of blue and black cards that are unblockable or super hard to block that you can play in 1, play on 2, Satoru on 3, and then on turn 4. I mean, the elephant in the room is Blightsteel Colossus. You attack with an unblockable 1/1 creature. Whoops! A Blightsteel Colossus turn into that. You're dead. The game is over. Hope you had fun. But I leave it up to you if that is what you want to do, or if there is maybe more fun and interactive ways to use this ability. It reads super degenerate to me. It reads very hard to make it fun and enjoyable for everyone, but I'm also not the best deck builder, and you might be. There's also a nicer version of Satoru. It's Satoru the Infiltrator, a 2-mana 2/3 human ninja rogue that has menace, and of course they somewhat work together because this Satoru reads whenever Satoru the Infiltrator and or 1 or more other non-token creatures enter the battlefield under your control. If none of them were cast or no mana was spent to cast them, you get to draw a card. This of course works well with the ninjutsu mechanic. I mean, that's kind of what they were going for, but it is more broad than that. It also works well with 0 mana creatures like Ornithopter. It works well with cost reduction, blink, reanimation, and even pitch cast creatures like Grief. There's not much more to say to this. It is very focused on generating card advantage. It also reads like something that could very well go infinite because this is not restricted to once a turn. But yeah, I really enjoy low cost commanders that are kind of open and just tie your deck together, whatever you want to do. We've talked about bad commanders, but this one might be the worst one yet. It's Skeleton Ship, a 5-mana 0/3 summon legend. If you now look at the details on Scryfall, it is a skeleton. If at any time you control no islands, you need to sacrifice Skeleton Ship. Wow. already off to a terrible start. You need to sacrifice it if you don't control an island. I bet the payoff is super good for it to have landed on this list. No, it is horrible. You tap Skeleton Ship to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Full stop, that is it, nothing else. Why is this card on the list? Because I love it. It is so dorky, it is so bad, it is so old. It's from Ice Age. What do we expect? I really have a soft spot for cards like this that are so weird, so bad, where you just go like, why does this card exist in this form? Of course, let's also talk about how to maybe somehow make this a playable commander. There is decent ways to enable this. First, there is a commander that I talked about in my Mono Black video. It is Maha, its Feathers Knight, a 5-mana 6/5. Flying Trample, ward, discard a card, but what we really care about is creatures your opponents control have base, toughness, 1. So as long as they don't have an equipment, enchantment, or +1/+1 counters, you can then just tap Skeleton Ship, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature, and yeah, you get removal on a stick. There's cards like Rumbling Ashes, a 2-mana enchantment that reads at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy target creature with a -1/-1 counter on it. Maybe you play Paradox Haze and have an additional upkeep, you get to destroy 2 creatures a turn. There is also a version of Massacre Girl that makes it so if an opponent's creature dies, if it had toughness 0 or less, you get to draw a card. Now, while still, it would probably be just better to play Maha as a commander if you're going for like -1/-1 counters. If you want to have a lower powered commander that makes people like chuckle, laugh, that makes you feel good when playing it, maybe Skeleton Ship is, for some weird reason, a great commander for you. It is definitely one for me. One archetype that we didn't really have so far is aggro, and it's understandable. Blue-black are like not very aggressive colors. Black sometimes has the sub-theme of draining life aggressively, and that's exactly what Sig River Cutthroat is going for. A 2-mana 1/3 Merfolk Rogue, and it's kind of the evil version of Sig the River Guide. It reads at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn, you may draw a card. Now, obviously, during your turn, it is very easy to manipulate this ability by attacking. You just need to deal 3 damage. That means you draw a card. What's more difficult is manipulating this effect so during an opponent's turn, they lose 3 life. Maybe they're generous and they fetch shock. Immediately, that's 3 life. Maybe you just are lucky and an enemy attacks another enemy. Boom, another opponent lost 3 life. You get to draw a card. But of course, when we talk about these cards, let's not talk about circumstances that are out of our control. Let's talk about cards that help us make this a functioning deck. Loyal Subordinate is a 3-mana 3/1 menace and has the Lieutenant ability, which is an ability that is always in effect as long as you have a commander. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, each opponent loses 3 life. This means so you don't have to attack, but it doesn't really fix the problem that during other people's turns we also want to trigger this ability. That's where cards like Painful Quandary, a 5-mana enchantment, come into play. It reads, whenever an opponent casts a spell, the player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. From my personal experiences, players hate to discard cards and would rather pay life, but depending on what type of players you're playing with, they might often opt to just discard a card even out of spite, so you don't get to draw a card. But the effect is powerful enough that sometimes they will just have to lose 5 life because their hand is so precious, so valuable. And for Sig River Cutthroat, these are exactly the type of effects that you need to keep an eye out for and try and find those gems to make Sig River Cutthroat an immensely powerful commander that draws you up to 4 cards a turn cycle. And the next one makes me a little angry, but not because of the card, because of the English language. It's Talion the... Yeah, what? Is it Kindly or Kindly Lord? I don't know. This is not my mother tongue. How am I supposed to know? I think it could be both. Anyways, it's a 4-mana 3/4 Fairy Noble. It has flying because it's a fairy, and as Talion the Kindly or Kindly Lord enters the battlefield, you get to choose a number between 1 and 10. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value, power, or toughness equal to the chosen number, the player loses 2 life and you draw a card. There is different ways to use this card, but I think this commander probably shines more in higher power level formats where the mana cost is condensed really tightly to like 0, 1, 2, maybe 3. What I like about this card is, first of all, it makes it so you need to know the decks your opponents are playing a lot. So maybe this is more for a fixed play group and not people who switch around a lot and play against completely new decks every time. What I also like is it needs you to make a decision that makes it so every game is different. The Ancient One from one of my favorite sets, the new Ixalan set, is a 2 mana 8/8, which is obscene, so where does the downside lie? The Ancient One has Descent 8, and it can't attack or block unless there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard. Now, of course, we are blue-black, so having 8 permanent cards in our graveyard should be relatively easy for us to do. To help a little, for 4 mana, you get to draw a card, then discard a card. When you discard a card this way, target player mills cards equal to its mana value. The obvious way to think about this is you pay for mana, you draw a card, discard a card that has high mana value, and then you target yourself so the Ancient One can attack. Of course, you could also try and use this as a way to mill out your opponents. That's why I'm saying it sits at an intersection. It is a 2 mana 8/8, which is obscene and very, very dangerous. You just need to hit someone 3 times without buffing, without anything, and they die to commander damage. But it also has that mill package, which is, funnily enough, a package that does not interact with an opponent's life total at all. Kind of like commander damage, also doesn't really care about the actual number of your life. The card that I found that, in my opinion, works the best with the Ancient One is the new version of Emrakul the World Anew. It's a 12 mana 12/12, so immediately you get to mill target player for 12. When you cast a spell, gain control of all creatures target player controls. Obscene effect. It has flying and protection from spells and permanents that were cast this turn, so kind of safe from removal spells in a way. And when Emrakul World Anew leaves the battlefield, sacrifice all creatures you control. Now, still, that doesn't really explain why the cards work well together, except high mana cost is great. This card works so well with the Ancient One because it has madness. So you get to activate the Ancient One for 4 mana, you get to discard Emrakul, and then if you have the mana, and I know it's expensive, you not only get to mill someone for 12, no, you also get to cast Emrakul, take control of all creatures target player controls, and really, really powerful synergy that admittedly costs a lot of mana. The Scarab God used to prey on decks in Standard, but he's also a viable commander. It's a 5 mana 5/5 god. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life, and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. So immediately it's a better zombie commander than Nafri Betrayer King. But it gets better because for 4 mana you get to exile target creature card from a graveyard, and then you get to create a token that's a copy of the creature you exiled. Instead, it's a 4/4 black zombie, and because of a god, of course, the Scarab God is hard to kill. When it dies, you get to return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Of course, this invites you to play a lot of zombies because scrying X is actually really powerful. It also invites you to play creature cards that you want to reanimate yourself. The ability is good and cheap enough that almost no matter your playgroup, there will always be a decent target somewhere, especially in the late game. But of course, if we're thinking about consistency, we want to include cards in our own deck. Archon of Cruelty always comes to mind as a card that you just want to reanimate. Umbris Fear Manifest is a 5 mana 1/1 Nightmare Horror, and Umbris gets +1/+1 for each card your opponents own in exile. Whenever Umbris or another Nightmare or Horror enter the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land card. So, the first time you play Umbris, immediately you will get the trigger and exile, let's say 3, 4, if you're super lucky, 6, 7 cards, and you will have a 5 mana 6, 6, 7, 7, 8, 8 commander. Immediately we see this is a Voltron commander and kind of nothing else. Voltron is interesting in blue-black because you don't have that many great options, but we just talked about the ancient one, and in my opinion it kind of does the Voltron thing better. And Umbris really is just a big beater. It does not have protection, it does not have any form of evasion, it is just gigantic. But that should never stop you from building a deck around it if you think the effect is interesting, if you like the flavor. So let's talk about how to enable it as best as possible. In my opinion, the easiest way to get cards into your opponent's exile is to combine Graveyard Hate with Mill. Just mill everyone for 10. Shouldn't be too hard to do by turn 5 when Umbris comes down. And then have out a Leyline or any 1 mana artifact that consistently whittles away, or Tormod's Crypt, which just gets rid of a graveyard with 0 mana. And I think it should be possible to make Umbris like a 30-30 at least by turn 5, and then one-shot someone if you have haste and evasion. But that's kind of like Christmas Wonderland scenarios, at least the haste and evasion part. It should be very easy to get Umbris to absurd numbers of power, but it will be hard in my opinion to make good use of the huge body that Umbris will provide. Second to last is Wrenn the Relentless, a 4-mana 3/4 rat rogue, the first rat commander that makes the list. Wrenn has Ward 2, which is very nice on a commander. If a creature an opponent controls would die, you get to exile it instead, and at the beginning of each end step, you get to create X 1/1 black rat creature tokens with this creature gets +1/+1 for each other rat you control, where X is the number of creatures your opponents controlled that were exiled this turn. Now, of course, when Wrenn is on the battlefield, each spot removal turns a dying creature into a creature that gets exiled, and thus you will be able to create a rat. Of course, if you have Grave Pact and a Sacrifice Outlet, it makes it so you can turn all those tiny rats and tiny rat creature tokens into more rats that are very, very huge because they get +1/+1 for each other rat. One of the cards that are best suited for this commander is Swarmyard Massacre, a 5-mana sorcery that lets you create 2 squirrels. Then each creature that isn't an insect, rat, spider, or squirrel gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each creature that is, well, an insect, rat, spider, or squirrel. I think this card is probably the best you can do to make use of Wrenn's third paragraph, and I really like that this is a good, viable blue-black rat commander, so you are not forced to play mono-black. We had one at the start, we had one in the middle. It is only just we return to fairies at the very end. Widwin the Biting Gale is a 4-mana 3/3 fairy wizard that has flash, of course, flying, of course. And for a blue, a black, and paying 1 life, you get to return Widwin the Biting Gale to its owner's hand. Fairies are vexing, that much is certain. And what is more annoying than a commander that just refuses to go back to the command zone? This works super well with all those ETB triggers that you might be having on board. It works super well with all those fairies that reward you for casting spells during an opponent's turn. Admittedly, as a commander, this is probably lower power level, but you might want to either include it in the 99 or choose it as a commander if other fairies might be too high power level. Or hey, nobody said you need to play this as a fairy commander. You could just be playing this as a super annoying blue-black commander that comes back and back and back and back. Did we not talk about your favorite blue-black commander? Make sure to give them a shout out in the comments, because I love nothing more than sharing passion for Magic. Personally, I'm looking forward to making more videos in 2025, as I was genuinely surprised by how well these videos were received. Anyways, always remember, be kind to yourself and others. Goodbye.